Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Delicious Legacy. How would our modern day-to-day life be in a world without sugar? Once it was called Indian salt or white salt. The Chinese lay claim to be the first to make it among their many inventions. It seems the art of making it, though, came from India. Sugarcane is a giant grass that once was native to the island of New Guinea. This is the history of sugar and sugarcane, the plant Saccharum officinarum, which today is found growing in many places around the world, but crucially used in so many of our foods that it certainly makes it ubiquitous. Darius the Great, the Persian king, is said to have discovered in India a reed that gives honey without the aid of bees and brought it home with him. A spice, as it was considered in the ancient world, more expensive than any other, and used for medicinal primarily purposes. Dioscorides, the ancient Greek, a contemporary of Augustus, remarks that there's a kind of solid honey called saccharum, which is found in the reeds of India and Arabia the Fortunate. It resembles salt in consistency and crunches in the mouth. Sweet foods are very rare in nature indeed, and exactly why, before the age of sugar, honey was the number one sweetener in the world, eaten and used by people all over. Energy-giving, it was the only sweetener available in a pure and natural state. We describe people as sweet when they're nice, polite and so on. Clearly sweetness is something we desire, something we need, something we revered as sacred since our deep ancient past. Honey and sugar have religious connotations too. But we also need high energy for our development. As a species, our need for sweet and sugar led us to develop ingenious ways to make things sweeter, from the development of sophisticated apiculture to agriculture and breeding selectively fruit-bearing plants that have more sugar. But how did sugar, as we know it today, came to the forefront of our lives, and how it created and was shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism and exploitation of humans and nature? I'm very pleased to have Neil Buttery on the podcast today, the food historian and author of A Dark History of Sugar, whose book is out now and traces the origins of all of the above, sugar's production and consumption, especially during the darkest parts between the 16th and 19th century. Neil Buttery, welcome to The Delicious Legacy.
Thank you very much for asking me to come on.
It's great to have you on the podcast. I've been following you, not in real life, but on Twitter and your internet output for a few years now. I'm not sure what was first, the Twitter, or I found you when I was looking for British food history and stuff, and I found your blog perhaps. But I think it's been at least 2.5 years, perhaps more. I'm not entirely sure. How long have you been going on?
Well, how long have I been going on? Feels like forever. It's one of those things where it's difficult to pin down an exact point. I only really got into food history because I didn't know anything about it. In fact, going back a little step, it was more getting into British cookery because I didn't really cook it. Cooking was a bit of a hobby, and that was about it. I just started a PhD in nothing really to do with history or food, but I knew that I would be having to write a lot. And I'd been out of academia for quite a few years, so I was quite worried about, we all know what it's like, that kind of empty screen with a flashing cursor in the corner, and you just got to sit there and write something. So I thought, okay, well, I should just practice writing. So I thought I'd start a blog on a food I don't know, a cuisine I don't know about. So I thought, let's go English. Somebody had bought me a book of English food by Jane Grigson, and I thought it was being very sort of unique in my thinking. And I thought, I'm going to cook every recipe, not realising that it's been done 100 times by other people, because I didn't really read blogs or anything. I was just doing this because I thought, well, maybe somebody will read it, so that'll make me try a bit harder. And really, it's just a way of me getting over the fear of having that blank screen when it came to writing. So that was the first blog, Neil Cooks Grigson, which no one reads, but that's fine. But I got really interested in British food in general, And I kind of wanted to start writing essays that maybe weren't captured in the book by Jane Grigson, the book English Food. So that's when British Food History took off, I suppose, in maybe 2011 is my guess. And that's the kind of one that got popular, I suppose. And then at some point between then and now, I've become a food historian. I can't quite pin down the exact time.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a long time. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, and so yeah, you have your podcast, which is called The British Food History.
Yes, it took me a while to think up that one. When I was looking, there is not a podcast about the history of British food.
There you go.
So I thought, right, well, I'm having that before somebody else thinks of it.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's how you should go. Yeah, I was kind of in the same train of thought, really, trying to find something that it will be will have historical connotations in a way, but not too obvious. But also, it's food, so kind of combine those things.
You've got a good title. I'm rubbish at titles, so I was very glad I could basically avoid thinking about.
Great, you're fantastic. Today's subject, we're going to discuss about sugar, because you wrote a book about sugar.
I did. The Dark History of Sugar.
Exactly.
Which, as it turns out, is basically the whole history of sugar. there's not many light bits.
Oh dear.
There are few.
Yeah. So the book was released when?
It was back in May of this year, 2022.
Great, fantastic. And it's called A Dark History of Sugar, of course. Basically, so I've read it and it's brilliant, and it has so many facts and so much history and a lot of things that obviously I don't know, and I think most of people don't know.
Yes, I think people, and I consider myself one of these people. You think you know,
yes,
and then you start looking at it and you go, "Oh my Lord!"
Great. I was going to ask you. So obviously, before we had sugar as humankind, obviously before we had something else, we had honey and fruits, right? We had all that stuff.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the origin, I suppose. Yes, so fleeting, seasonal gluts of sugar. So that was, most commonly fruit. When it comes to, really highly concentrated sugar, it was honey. I would say. I mean, maybe to a lesser degree, some vegetables. It was really fruit and honey. But I mean, I don't know what percentage sugars is in a regular, random, average fruit, but they're mainly water, I would say. Fruits are. Apart from maybe a date, they're probably fairly sugary. So really, even to the vast degree, most of the time, the sugar you're getting from fruits is very dilute with other stuff. Yeah. So honey was the real big important one. And you see it in, all the major religions. Land of milk and honey and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It was considered manna from the gods.
And so when, obviously with sugar, when are the first evidence that we started actually using sugar as humankind? Well,
when it comes to sugar cane, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about sugar. Sugar cane, if you remember from school, sucrose. You got to go back to 8,000 BCE, New Guinea, for the first time anybody was growing sugarcane. In fact, the New Guineans were pretty, they're very important because they were also the first to grow bananas and yams as well, two other extremely important foods. Yeah. So they were really on it. They were very good gardeners. But they were really only growing it as a snack food. So they would basically, they'd selectively bred it to have a thinner sort of skin, a thinner rind, because it's a bit like wild sugarcane's a bit like bamboo. So it's actually quite woody. Yeah. But they'd bred it to have a thinner skin so they could cut it and chew it themselves. Right. So that's the origins of sugar. And this is, I suppose, all this bit is the not dark stuff. This is all kind of nice. It wasn't an important source of carbohydrates because they had bananas, they had yams. Those boxes were already ticked. So this was just a little kind of fun snack for them. But if you're thinking about actual sugar as a product, you have to go to India.
Right.
Probably. How it got there from New Guinea, we don't know. But if you've ever grown a kind of big grass like bamboo, you'll know it's basically an aggressive weed. And it ends up popping up all over the place in the garden. So it could have just got there on its own accord, just by spreading. Or it could have been taken by traders, we don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, about 1000 BCE, we reckon.
So we are in India and we have the first mass, I guess, cultivation and extraction of sugar.
Yeah, this is where they're trying to make a solid product, I suppose. It's not sugar crystals. It's basically an unrefined sugar. Well, I mean, if you cook any kind of food from Asia, really, and a lot of Africa, you'll come across jaggery.
Yeah.
Which original name for it is gur. Yes, the kind of lumps of kind of pale brown unrefined sugar. So that's an Indian invention. Curiously enough, jaggery is actually an African word.
Right.
Gur is from the time of old Hindu, say 1000 BC. Jaggery is actually the name given to gur by African slaves or their descendants.
Right.
But going forward in time, quite a few centuries, there were Africans or people of African origin with Indians in India growing sugar. So you get this weird mix of cultures and words, which I think is quite interesting. I just assumed jaggery was a word that was Indian.
Yeah. True, yeah.
But I mean, as we might find out, depending on what we talk about, the mixing of, I mean, it's possibly one of the good things that's come out of it. I mean, although no one was saying it at the time, but the great thing about sugar is lots of different cultures mixed.
Right.
I mean, they had to go through a whole lot of crappy times, especially with the English, but hopefully we're coming out the other side.
Yeah.
So yeah, the kind of mixing up of lots of different cultures, the production of melting pots of cultures, I suppose, which, yes, people sometimes view as bad, but I hope most people see that as a good thing now.
I agree with that. Okay, so we have the Indians that they produce this refined product, jaggery, and they started using it in cooking and as medicine and all that stuff.
Yeah, because it's around this time you see the first mentions of sugar. There's no real recipes, but there's mentions of sweetened rice puddings or making of sweets where you mix them with ground rice and spices and roll them into balls or maybe fry them. Probably not that dissimilar to what you might see in Indian sweet houses now, really. Very important religiously. Different cohorts of people within Hindu society could not eat certain things. If you were considered a holy person, there were lots of things off the menu, most, or maybe even all, maybe apart from milk, all animal products were not allowed, but sugar was considered so wonderful that everybody should be allowed to eat it. So very important in Hindu religion and still is very important too.
Right. And from there, I suppose, ancient Greece and Rome, honey was the king. So everything was sweetened by honey. So, and I guess throughout this part of the Western civilizations like Mesopotamia and in Egypt and Greece and Rome, they used honey throughout antiquity. The first mentions, I suppose, the first contact with the Indians from Alexander the Great onwards, there was the first contact with sugar, right?
That's right, yeah. But nothing really seemed to take off. I think it's one of Alexander the Great's generals went to India. Yes, they found sugar, they brought it back. Whether Alexander the Great actually saw it himself, I don't know. But they obviously thought, well, this is interesting enough to bring back. But everyone was just like, it's all right.
Yeah, I suppose it was difficult to extract it and make it in a commercial, industrial manner.
It's a massive process producing sugar, even unrefined jaggery. it's quite a process. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if you did want to make sugar, you'd have to really want to make it and put in a huge amount of effort. And like you say, if honey is the favourite, and let's face it, it's better, objectively. Honey's so much better than sugar. Why go through all that effort,
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose one thing, maybe we could explain a little bit to our listeners about if you have any idea how they used to make sugar or how they used to extract this from the plant. Because, I mean, it's a very intensive process. I mean, do you have any vague idea, any?
Well, when it comes to India, in India, you mean?
Yeah, back then, yeah.
It's essentially just the canes were probably crushed, not unlike you would make flour, just between stones.
Stones, yeah.
And they would capture the juice, came out of it. Or similar perhaps as how some countries produced olive oil. So that's just kind of, grinding and turning is something that pretty much most civilizations were doing around that time. They had that ability, the larger ones anyway. So that was basically it. And then boiled down. And it's really quite difficult. I mean, I don't know if you've done much cooking and done much sugar work. It does get difficult when you've got a very concentrated sugar syrup. Things can crystallize, things can burn.
Yes.
So I guess that's the point at which India stopped. You get like a thick, very dark, gloopy substance, and you just let it cool down, and it goes a little bit paler as it cools and dries. And it's not like they didn't have the wherewithal to go to the next stage. They were just thinking, well, we're happy with this. This is nice. And it's one of those funny things, isn't it? Because pure sugar just essentially tastes of nothing else but sweetness. But things like jaggery or soft brown sugar, is such a more interesting flavour.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can understand why they didn't really go any further with the purification, because it's pretty good stuff.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and then what's the next stage then? I mean, of the sugar's travel and evolution from east to west, because we find it in the Arab world like 600-700 years later.
Yeah, it's odd.
More. Yeah,
really odd. It just appears fully formed. So it's just a great big gap. The Persian Empire had similar flirtations in the past with sugar going to India. But there's about a gap of 1,000 years between them coming across it and kind of doing the same as Alexander the Great and went, yeah, it's fine, but I'm not bothered. But suddenly 1,000 years later, they're making sugar, and it's what we would think today of as sugar. So, reasonably pure crystal sugars that are, well, maybe not pure brilliant white, but not too far off.
By a product that is basically taking the world by storm, in a sense.
And it's a system or a method that we assume they developed, because we don't know, because there's a great big gap. But it really didn't change. I mean, it was modified, but it really wasn't changed until you get to industrial sugar production in America, which is quite a feat, really. And they, for some reason, when you read about the history of sugar, no one really seems to make a point of that. I mean, I'm certainly not saying it's anyone's fault for sugar taking over the world. I think it just shows how resourceful and intelligent they were. I mean, they would go on to form a great big empire. So they obviously knew what they were doing, and they were highly organised, and they produced this stuff for themselves. It wasn't a cash cow for them. They weren't selling it all around the world at massively inflated prices. They were just selling it within their empire as a treat for each other.
Right.
So again, not really that dark, but I guess that process that they'd refined, essentially was the one that the Europeans picked up and ran away with.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of the next chapter on our sugar history, which becomes darker.
Yes, that's so. Unfortunately, I mean, I had a very low word count, 70,000 words, which sounds a lot when you start writing, but then when you find out there's so much stuff, that is dark, talk about sugar. I'd written loads about the Persians and the Muslim Empire, but because none of it was dark, I kind of had to really pare it back and condense it all. But it's a really interesting area, and if people are interested in it, there's loads of stuff available online as ebooks.
Yeah, but back to your book and the dark history of sugar, I suppose. Yeah, so you will investigate all that stuff, and then obviously we go forward in time and we reach the time of the European colonization and exploitation of the planet.
Yes.
As such. So we have who were the first Europeans that developed a system for mass cultivation and industrialization of the sugar plantations?
Well, it was born out of the Crusades, ironically.
Another positive thing from the Crusades.
Yeah. The first crusade, about 1100, isn't it? Yes, off they all went, captured the Holy Land. There was the Siege of Acre, which was, they had potential to lose there. There was a siege, they were starving. Stories differ. Some people gave them sugar cane or sugar, and it basically stopped them from starving. And they thought it was great. They brought it back. Again, people were a bit, that's all right. But then the Second Crusade, and people really took more notice of sugar cane and how it was produced. That's when it really became a thing. And what you got were really very rich groups of people, notorious groups, I suppose, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, these kind of warrior knight monks. I guess it would be the best. They were very high up in the echelons of society all across Europe, Western Europe, and they were putting the money in to pay for, first of all, the sugar in the Middle East, because they essentially kicked everybody out. Of course, there was toing and froing, and suddenly getting the upper hand and the lower hand, and all it went on for centuries, didn't it?
Yeah.
And eventually they kind of thought, oh, okay, we're not going to win this. But at least we know how to make sugar now. And they essentially went westward, kind of on the north coast of the Mediterranean and through the Mediterranean islands, trouncing through, basically.
Right.
Making sugar is it uses a huge amount of energy, unbelievably large amount of energy. If you've got 7 kilos of juice, sugarcane juice, you have to boil away 5 kilos of water to get 2 kilos of sugar. So it was one of the first environmental disasters essentially caused by man, because they deforested the whole of the north coast of the Mediterranean and the islands, like Sicily and Cyprus and those kind of places.
Wow. Not
for a second thinking they were doing anything bad.
Madeira and the Azores and all these islands were big forested, essentially rainforests, tropical rainforests. And they were, in a few years, they were completely devastated, cut down for sugar production.
Yeah, it was shocking. And I mean, again, one of the things that people don't realize, we think of how the indigenous races of the Americas, North and South Americas, as well as the West Indies were, murdered and exploited and still are, shunned by a lot of white colonists, because that's what we still are. I'm going to include all of us white people in this. There's still, but what people don't realize, there were indigenous people on Madeira as well who went extinct.
Right. Okay. That's something that's not.
It's not, and again,
talked about.
Unfortunately, it's one of those things where I didn't get a chance to really focus on that in the book. I do talk about what happened to indigenous races in general, I suppose, when we do get to the Americas. Yeah,
which is it's exactly our next step now from Madeira and the time of Henry VIII. Then we go to the exploitation of Americas from Columbus onwards. So there again, initially the Spanish went for gold, obviously, and to discover a new route, a new sea route. But how did that end up being the place that sugar actually took roots and the dark history of sugar actually is where becomes really, really dark.
Well, Columbus, he had it wasn't his wife, but she wasn't a mistress. He was in some kind of relationship with a lady called Beatrice, and her father was a big sugar baron, I suppose, a proto-sugar baron on the Canary Islands. And when he went on his second voyage, so first voyage makes friends, in inverted commas, with the indigenous people. Second time, he goes on, he's asked to bring with him, amongst lots of other people with different trades, as well as various different crops, so either cuttings or seeds. Off he went, and in amongst there was some cuttings of sugarcane. So from the get-go, really sugar's involved. It didn't really become the main focus, because as you say, really what they wanted was gold. They also took other things like tobacco and indigo and various expensive dye woods like sandalwood. It wasn't just about sugar. Tobacco as well eventually also went over. Another thing with a dark history, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Columbus did not care about the sugar. It's very likely his sugar pretty much died. And really, it required bedlam to have occurred. So off they went. So they arrive at the island with a letter from the king to the people saying, you don't own this island anymore. The king owns this island. And if you, I'm paraphrasing, and if you essentially try and stop us or argue with us, then you're essentially breaking the law. And that's exactly how they took over. And Columbus made a note in his journal saying just how, I guess, weak and feeble and trusting and nice the people were. That I think he said it just took one or two men to overcome 50 of them, because they were so trusting. And he'd been round once, shaking hands with them, going, yeah, great,
right.
And then off he went, rubbing his hands, going, these are going to be easy to kill later. There's a Christopher Columbus Day, where he's celebrated in America, and he's one of the vilest people to have ever existed. He's just cruel. He was extremely religious, and really he terrorized not just the indigenous people, but also, the other Spanish as well. And really, essentially got all the gold. They'd taken all the land. They hadn't bothered growing staple crops.
Any food.
They were starving. They decided that they should eat all the meat, but didn't, because that's all they had to eat, and they didn't breed more animals, so they ended up starving. It was just a disaster. Some official from Spain came over, and he was greeted with, I think, 7 men hanging from a gallows when he went into the harbour, because the people were revolting, because it was just absolute nightmare. Christopher Columbus is sent back to Spain in shackles for the mismanagement of it all. And this guy ends up taking it over, and it's just one regular guy. I've forgotten what his original trade was, but he was something like, maybe, I don't know, an ex-surgeon or something. And he said, look, people, we're focusing on the wrong thing. It doesn't matter about the gold. What we need to do is we need to make sugar. And really, it was not that much to do with Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus came back about 7 years later. I mean, you'd hang your head in shame, wouldn't you, if it was you? But, he just comes straight back with a load of money that he's financed, and he just starts to grow massive plantations and starts putting other people out of business. Ooh, he was a bastard.
Christ, yeah. He doesn't stop.
No.
He just doesn't stop in a bastard.
Greedy, murderous, conniving, underhand, cruel. The list of words goes on that you could use to describe him.
Today's episode is brought to you with the welcome support of Malbin Greek, UK's leading Greek delicatessen supplier and distributor of premium Greek produce. Whatever your needs, Malbin Greek has you covered. You can shop online and have the divine and delicious goods delivered to your doorstep across the UK, or you can visit the shop at Arch 17 Apollo Business Park, Lucy Way, SC16 4ET, Bermondsey, London. Malbin Greek, the one-stop shop for your Greek fix. And for you dear listeners, there's a fantastic discount of 15% if you use online the discount code DELICIOUS.
Hello, this is Dr. Ran.
And this is Dr. G.
And together, we're the co-hosts of The Partial Historians.
We love ancient Rome and all the quirks that humanity has to offer. Join us for our narrative episodes as we explore the history of Rome from the founding of the city.
Or perhaps you'd like to drop by for our special episodes on topics such as historical films, ancient personalities, academic guests, and our never-ending fight about who was the better emperor, Augustus or Tiberius.
You can find The Partial Historians wherever you listen to quality podcasts such as The Delicious Legacy. We're out and about on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
And now, back to your regular program.
Yeah, and obviously all these concepts of land ownership and all that meant nothing to the locals, to indigenous people. There was no concept of the land belonging to someone.
Yeah, exactly. It just was completely alien concept. I mean, it is a bizarre concept when you think about it. Yeah, you own a piece of the planet. What? Mm-hmm. But we're so used to thinking of it in those terms, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean that's what kickstarted it, and the West Indies basically was the fertile ground for sugar growing and production, and obviously then.
Yeah, it was great, the West Indies, because it was tropical or near tropical, so they could grow it most of the year. When they're growing it in places like Spain, you know, it was only about a third of the year they could grow it.
Yeah,
it was too cold otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah. So they were. I mean, the people working. It was relentless for the people working there. You have to when you cut down the sugarcane and then crush it in the roller mills to get the juice out. You have to start boiling it down within 24 hours. Otherwise, it starts to ferment and it spoils the flavour. It goes sour. I guess like sourdough, I suppose. You know, it's those kind of fermenting microbes.
Very interesting.
And you don't want that taste in it. You want a nice, just pure sweetness, I suppose. That's what they were aiming for.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when it was harvest time, those mills were going 24 hours a day. Mm. And they were using mainly, you know, indigenous people to work those mills. They all died from their point of view, from the Europeans' point of view, they died because they were feeble and basically crap. Whereas, in fact, they were enslaved and they caught all the diseases, European diseases that they'd never met before.
Yeah.
And that basically...
They didn't have any immunity.
Yeah, I mean, smallpox was the major one. You know, it essentially sent them... several tribes did go extinct, you know, never to return.
Yeah. I mean, there's some numbers that I remember for Hispaniola, where Columbus landed. So Hispaniola was inhabited by 5 to 8 million people. So there's some estimates, like between 3 and 8 million, and lower and a high estimate. Yeah. So about, we say 3 to 8 million people lived in Hispaniola. And then by like 40 years later, it was what? 20, 200, something like that.
Yeah, they're just...
Nothing.
Yeah, in one generation, I guess, it's just all gone.
The devastation that was caused, it's immense. We cannot really... There's no parallel like this, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. And what I kind of think of is, you know, when we think about the medieval period, you know, we think, it's all backwards and dark and vicious and horrible, and everyone's got war hammers and they're cutting each other's heads off or whatever. And we think of the modern period, which we're in now, as this some enlightened time. I mean, the cut-off between what's modern and what's medieval, I mean, changes depending. But it's usually, I think most people say, it's when we discovered the Americas. Because it's like, I know we don't know where Australia is at this point, but it's, you know, it's globalization begins.
Yeah.
But what really begins is the mass enslavement of the indigenous people of Africa and the Americas. You know, something that I'm going to say we've not even started clearing up the mess. In fact, we're probably still making it more messy. And that's the mark of the modern world. That shitstorm. Yeah. Am I allowed to swear? Sorry. You know, that's basically, that's the point at which it becomes modern. And I just kind of think, I wish we had. I wish we could
prefer the medieval.
Yeah, medieval sounds a lot better. Or at least could we pick a different date?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's one of those things where, where we in Europe, we're victims of propaganda, really. We're told all this stuff is amazing. And these various, certainly if you're British, the British Empire was amazing. I'm sure in Spain, they probably think that their empire was a pretty amazing thing too. And I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm saying it was a very mixed bag. And there was a lot of really, from the point of view of, I'm getting ahead of myself, I suppose, but it's the British Empire I know more about because I'm British.
Yeah.
You don't get to become the biggest empire on the earth by walking in there going, oh, hello, nice to meet you, shake hands. That is not what happened, obviously.
Yeah, that's not what empires do to become empires.
Yeah, exactly. You're ruthless is what you are.
Yeah.
But we're sold, and many people still believe, and probably because we are still sold it, that we went in and made things better.
Of course.
And, that's what the other empires were also doing as well. It wasn't just I'm not picking on Britain or England, folks. There were other empires. There are other empires available.
Yeah. There's no single empire in the history that wasn't ruthless and violent. So we're kidding ourselves.
Yes.
If we think, but no, we were the good ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Not really.
Exactly.
Not really. This violence and this exploitation of the indigenous people and cultures follows a very close path with the sugar, with the mass production of sugar and industrialization.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So, like I said before, there were other things being grown, and there were things being mined as well as grown. It's not just sugar's fault. And at this point, I suppose it isn't sugar's fault. It's almost a secondary thing. But once it gets going and people start producing that white gold, that's when empires are created rather than just colonies. As soon as sugar's being produced, it all changes because it uses up indigenous people and Africans. We haven't really talked about how the Africans got involved in that. Maybe we'll go back to that. But it was enslaving and killing all these people, and it was deforesting the place. And it was making people rich, and it was just fueling things. And then you've got the Portuguese who went down to Brazil, and then you've got France and England going, we'd like to be involved too, please. And, they take a few small islands, and then England, really takes over. Eventually becomes the British Empire, but it's the English Empire that gets things going. And suddenly you've got this fight between different nations' empires, all going off thousands of miles away from their home countries, and it's, as you can imagine, it's a cutthroat place to be. I'm not making excuses for any of them. They were not, they were dastardly people. But if you were just some poor peasant, because they did have peasants working there too, of European descent, it must have just been awful, really bad.
Difficult environment, obviously tropical. The Europeans aren't used to it. They enslave and kill and work to death the locals, and then obviously you need some new workforce to grow all this sugar. So what do you do?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you do have some peasants working there that or people maybe that tried to set up their own plantation but found that they didn't have the aptitude for it or didn't have the money for it, so they ended up just working for someone else. So that was all fine. But it wasn't really going to cover it. They were used to having these big workforces of, I guess, unskilled labour. So they turned to Africa. Now, they'd already actually been buying slaves from Africa since they were on the Canary Islands. Mm-hmm. And it was purely, I suppose, bad luck rather than racism, at least what we think of as racism today. We get on shaky ground at this point. I realise I'm a white Englishman talking now. I'm very aware of this. Slaves have been used, and you'll probably know more about this than me. Slavery has been part of civilization forever, and it's always bad. Of course, it's always bad. But usually, slaves are often prisoners of war or people who are in the way. And they are just ways of overcoming people so you can take that land yourself. What was different with the slaves in Africa, they were being moved away from Africa to go somewhere else. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
Suddenly that requires trade, and then there's a real slave trade. I mean, well, I suppose the Portuguese are the ones that really went for it. But the reason the connections there is, well, it's really sad, I suppose. 16th century, there's a Portuguese captain exploring, in inverted commas, Africa
Yeah.
to take ivory and spices and gold and maybe some people back, some indigenous people back to court to be gawped at by, by the king. Or by the prince or whatever. Standard stuff at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They came across some men of African and Asian descent. And they were all Muslims. Obviously,
Right.
they must have come from where, I guess, Morocco and Angola are now. And they must have bumped into them and they thought, well, they're pretty exotic. We're going to enslave these guys. Again, nothing abnormal so far for the time. But what happened was they said, hang on a minute, you can't be enslaving us because we're Muslim. And I know you're Christian, but we're basically worshipping the same God here. We're godly people, we're not, in inverted commas, savages.
Right.
And they said, right, well, we can't be enslaved, but we know some people who can. Not only can you enslave them, they want to be enslaved. Because they are, and I don't know how well you know your Bible. I don't know it very well. But they are the sons of Ham. And Ham was one of the sons of Noah.
Right.
Who got cursed by Noah. I won't go into the reasons.
Yeah.
It involved him getting drunk and naked. It's very strange. I don't really understand. But anyway,
Yeah.
Ham was cursed by Noah to a life of servitude. And not only that, he included all of his descendants in that curse. And these captured Muslim guys essentially said, that's who you're going to find in Africa.
Right.
And they went, okay, well, we'll let you go then. And off they went and collected a few Africans, maybe a dozen or two, captured them, bundled them in, and off they went to supplement the workforce a little bit in the Canaries and in Madeira. They were brought over to Hispaniola to work in the mines, and they noticed, because Africa and Europe kind of do mix a little bit, they were brought over and they weren't affected by the diseases like the indigenous people were.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you their weird logic proved them right, because off they went, all the indigenous people died from the West Indies. You take these Africans from Africa and they don't die. And why is that? It's because they want to be slaves, obviously.
Wow.
And
okay.
That's essentially how the link between African slaves and sugar and I guess the history of America, I suppose.
Yeah, the New World.
Began, that New World. So that's how it happened, which is, really sad. It's almost just like bad luck. Which I'm not sure which is kind of worse for some reason, I think. It's one of those things that kind of really gives me a shiver when I think about it. How different the world could have been.
Yeah, small events, small changes.
Yeah, really.
It's nothing. There's nothing that predetermined that path of humanity in Europe, more specifically. But it was just some chance like this.
Yes, it's not very often where you think people. You often say, or people often say, one person doesn't make a difference. It's about,
right,
cultures changing over time. But sometimes it really is one person or a small group of people anyway that really do make a difference, intentional or unintentional.
Yeah.
When I was writing this part of the book, at the beginnings of slavery, of black people from Africa, slavery of Western Central Africa in the main, it was all the Black Lives Matter protests where people were having usually white men having a complete meltdown because, and I'm not having a go, in a weird way, I almost felt sorry for them. They could not compute what on earth was happening because they'd been told that Great Britain was great. We get one lesson at school. I hope it's different now, but people of my age got one lesson at school about the slave trade, and it was, oh, the slave trade was bad. There's that famous picture of all the slaves lined up, in the hull of that ship, the Brooks ship. It's a very famous drawing. And then, on the double page of your textbook, that's on one page. And then the facing page, it's, and the British abolished slavery. Aren't we brilliant? That's essentially the lesson. In a nutshell.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of not white people saying, no, you're not great. In fact, actually, you're pretty, well, not you specifically, but, as a whole, there's a lot to answer for. And they just didn't know what to do. And there's that infamous, I don't know if you remember this, there was a guy guarding the Winston Churchill statue.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he was giving Nazi salutes. I mean, where do you start to, if you walked up to that guy, how would you start to unpack that?
Yeah, there's...
So it was very much in mind. I thought, okay, at that point, I thought, right, we really need to connect the dots here through, like I just described, that kind of piece of bad luck, but how they, black people through no fault of their own at all, got caught up in this. And you can connect the dots, right, all the way back. And okay, it wasn't sugar at first that maybe displaced those Africans, but it was sugar that accelerated the fighting between the European nations and accelerated their spread over the Americas.
Talk to us a little bit about the life of slaves in a sugar plantation, because that's quite the harrowing, I think, story.
Yeah, it was a difficult one to write, that one. It was very stressful. When I was writing it, I was very worried that it could come across as gratuitous, because I very graphically, I don't describe, I quote people describing it. I tried not to use my words as much as possible. It's not a lazy get out. I thought, if I can find somebody who was there, even better, somebody who was a slave themselves, to tell their story, then I will use their words. It's not my place. Unless I have to, there's no other way around it. It's not my place to put words into people's mouths. Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff was absolutely shocking. And all because, they really thought that they wanted to be there, or that the slavery would be worse, or the treatment would be worse by the other people in Africa. And these people were queuing up to be treated from their point of view, this amazing way. And they were housed in huts made out of leftover cane garbage, just the crushed canes. That was what they were living in. That's if they survived the voyage. Yeah.
If you survive the voyage, malnourished.
I mean, Philip Curtin is the historian that really worked out the statistics of that transatlantic journey, because, I mean, it's amazing what he did. He just went through all of the accounts of slaves through the whole of the slave trade. So this isn't the official count. There's a lot of, clandestine trade that was going on, but it was just under 13 million Africans moved from Africa to the West Indies and to South America, and only 75% of them actually got there. So a quarter of them died en route because the conditions were just so awful. Whether that's just the dysentery that broke out, the fact that boats had to wait ages in Africa till they filled it up, something that you don't necessarily think about. It's quite hard to capture hundreds of people who don't want to be captured. So it takes ages, to actually fill up the boat. So some people are sat, in the hull of ships for months before they even get a chance to set off. And then there's other things like the scurvy and all sorts of things that you associate with long journeys. And then there's the ordeal of getting into the harbours where, they're just getting tossed about in boats and bones broken. And, and that, I mean, it's just a taster of the horrificness they're going to be subjected to, So it was a really exhausting, mentally exhausting thing to write. Because like I say, you think about these things, but then you find these accounts by slaves, or sometimes it's the white people who were running the show, or maybe just people who were observing. And it's just unbelievable, slaves being sold per pound, like they're a piece of meat, just stuff like that. Kind of the dehumanization of it is, I guess, on some levels, probably the worst. I mean, I know obviously being beaten and worked so hard is obviously awful, but the way they so cleverly dehumanized them, so that people wouldn't feel guilty for, because you're just asking, okay, you might be a sugar baron with a great big, you're basically some kind of psychopath running this big, your own little empire, sugar empire, but you employ normal people. So how do you get them to do all this awful stuff? Just lie and tell them these people want to be treated like this, and it does them good. They like it.
Yeah, they like it. They deserve it. That's how they...
Yeah, just try to assuage their guilt as much as possible, because obviously nobody would do that.
Yeah, so all these harrowing stories that you were finding out, so you were finding accounts from the time while you were writing your book, and you were uncovering more and more of this dark history of sugar. I mean, did you go out of your way to find that, or it was kind of because you were writing the history of sugar, these things were there, obvious, but with...
Yeah, yes and no, I suppose. I mean, obviously, you don't need to do much research before you know slavery's got to be a major part of the book.
Yeah, for sure.
But those accounts, I was not aware of most of those accounts before I started looking. So it became, I think it's maybe 3 chapters of the book, which perhaps some people might say that's a bit too much, but I just think it's very important. It's a bit of history that's, well, let's say in the past has been a bit flabby, and people have not really done the work because it's... People go, historians, they're changing the history, these woke historians. It's like, no, we're just saying all the stuff that the other people missed out. It wasn't hard to find. I wrote this during lockdown, so it was all books that were online on Google Books. We can all find this information now. It's all there. Primary sources, they're all there.
Exactly, but that's the thing. It's primary sources. It's not.
I'm not making
made
it
up
up
and rewritten.
Yeah. Let's destroy these people with a lot of made-up woke nonsense. I'm literally quoting people. The people running their places, not just, not necessarily just the slaves themselves. It's all there in black and white. Nobody reports it because that's not, from the point of view of where I'm from, that's not Great Britain, is it? It's not very great. So we'll miss those bits out and maybe nobody will see them.
But I suppose the common people noticed at some point, because that's why there was this push of abolishing slavery in the 19th century, right? I mean, it had something to do with sugar again, that bit. Kind of like people noticed that the cheap and abundant sugar in Britain was because there was slavery somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying before how pliable we are and how we just be in for it. That's not the case with everybody. And right from the beginning, right from enslaving the indigenous people before the African slave trade got going, there were people against it, but they were a minority. Sometimes they were fairly prominent people. And, they would give them little tours and make sure that they didn't see the whippings. They said to maybe the overseers, oh, so-and-so's coming tomorrow, so, don't whip people as much.
Right.
Or, we'll show them the nice bits so that people wouldn't cotton on. But eventually, yes, people really cottoned on, especially when it became mass, I suppose, enslavement of Africans. When people realised who was there, because... I mean, we're all guilty of it now. You get given a thing, it's cheap, it's great. I'll pay the money.
Yeah.
Don't think about it. There was enough stuff kind of beginning to filter down by the end of the 18th century, and people really started to take notice. There were quite a few freed slaves at this point managing to find, or escaped slaves managed to find their ways to Britain. And they knew that, and I'm not sure if I would have done this if I were them. They knew that they had to come over and they had to essentially make friends with these people and convince them it was a bad thing. And it was very much Quakers who kind of really pricked their ears up,
right,
and middle-class women who didn't have very much to do because, they were employing servants to run the house, but it was considered vulgar to get a job. So they had lots of time on their hands. So that's how it kind of began, these kind of 3 very different types of people: devout Quakers, essentially bored middle class or upper middle class housewives, and escaped or freed slaves. but they chipped away, and eventually important people got involved, like Josiah Wedgwood, made all the beautiful Staffordshire porcelain. He got behind it. An MP, William Wilberforce, got behind it. And William Wilberforce, God bless him, he was an MP, an independent MP, and he tried to get an act for abolition through the Houses of Parliament like 14 times. And,
Good for
God
him.
love him.
Persistent.
Absolutely persistent. Eventually, the Whigs, who were kind of the more, well, by our standards today, they're not left-wing, but by the standards of the day, they were fairly
liberal.
left-wing. Yeah, and they really ran with it, and suddenly it became the big topic for the general election, and it was a landslide win. So, because the Tories were essentially saying the country is going to go bust because we need slaves and we need sugar. If we get rid of slavery on the sugar islands, the sugar colonies, we're screwed. Do you want to live in a country where we're all starving to death? That was their line of argument. And all right, it took 14 goes, but fair play. Eventually we said, no, we're not taking this nonsense. This is obviously nonsense. So yes, it did go through eventually. Yeah.
Fantastic. Finally. Yeah. And now, for the exclusive bit for Patreon backers only, have a peek. Since then, so the history of sugar, is it getting any brighter? Since then?
Well, the pockets are getting brighter, let's say. Exploitation's always been associated with it. Abolishing slavery did not end exploitation. In fact, if anything, it made it worse to some degrees. But, there are companies... The ball's in our court. We've got to change it, because otherwise nothing's going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, if not now, then when? We have to do something now.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. So we better get cracking.
Excellent. Well, we can talk for hours, of course, all night if you want to, but I guess you have other things to do. Thank you so much for coming in the podcast and talking with me about the dark history, the dark side of sugar.
It's been good fun. It was good talking about the early days of sugar. People don't usually ask me to talk about those, so that was fun to talk about.
Yeah. At least we had that bit. Excellent. Thank you so much, and see you. Well, we talk again online and all that stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. Join us next time for more archaeogastronomical adventures. If you liked this episode, please leave a review and rate it. And also, if you would like the episodes ad-free with extra content, please sign up on our Patreon and become a subscriber there to get the best archaeogastronomical content out there. Thank you. Bye.